Hello, everyone, and welcome to the opening session of the Rumsfeld Foundation's Virtual Graduate Fellowship Conference. Thanks for joining us. And thank you to Secretary Rumsfeld out in the wilds of New Mexico someplace, and Bridget, Sarah, and Courtney in DC making all this possible. Some of you may already know me, but for those of you I've yet to meet, I am Randy Roberts, 150th anniversary professor at Purdue University and a faculty advisor for the fellowship program. While you know our friends, the Rumsfeld Foundation, wish we could gather in DC as in years past, I'm excited with the impressive lineup of speakers and virtual sessions that the foundation has arranged for us throughout the week. Today, I have the great honor of kicking off the conference activities with President of Purdue University and former governor of Indiana, Mitch Daniels. 4 years ago, during another election, George Will wrote, "Purdue has the president that the nation needs." In the current crisis, it still may be true, and maybe we'll see some evidence of it today. As president of Purdue, Mitch Daniels is known for taking on challenges in higher education with innovative initiatives. From his extensive background prior to his current role, he also has wide-ranging experience across public and private sectors. Mitch Daniels could be the prototype for Secretary Rumsfeld's ideal public servant. Like Secretary Rumsfeld, he has moved seamlessly between the public and private sectors, much like past leaders like John Foster Dulles and John Kenneth Galbraith. Before becoming the 12th president of Purdue University, he served as Senator Richard Lugar's chief of staff, Ronald Reagan's political advisor, president of the Hudson Institution, various executive positions with Eli Lilly, George Bush's director of the OMB, and governor of Indiana. During his life in public and private sectors, President Daniels has earned a reputation for demanding the greatest value at the lowest cost. In this, he reminds me of the Chicago Bears owner, George Halas, whose player, Mike Ditka, accused Halas one time during a salary negotiation of throwing around nickels like manhole covers. But the result has been great for Purdue students. No tuition hikes since he became president. I could go on, but then Mitch would not have time to talk. President Daniels, we have a lot to discuss, so let's begin. You have some opening remarks.
Well, very brief ones, Randy, but I do have to start by paying tribute to two terrific individuals. One is the person you just heard from. Randy Roberts is one of the finest scholars at our entire institution, certainly I think the finest anywhere in or near his discipline, and one of a handful of those of whom we're most proud and to whom we look the most for guidance. And then, of course, Don Rumsfeld is to use a phrase that is used too loosely, but certainly applies in this case, is a great American and has been now for several decades. And if you want to look for a genuine model and prototype for your own careers, you couldn't have chosen more wisely than you have in associating with him. And I trust that the fellowship program allows you not only to learn about him, but to get some direct personal exposure, really, to one of the courageous and most insightful and genuinely patriotic people I've ever known. Now, I want to get rather quickly to the questions where I'm sure the most important the topics will come up. Let me just, I was asked to say a few words by way of preface, and I guess they would be these. The year we're in has demonstrated in a way even more pronounced than should have been obvious already what the real challenges of authentic leadership are. And more than anything, this comes to a willingness and a determination, really, to think about the entire public interest. In a position of high responsibility, by definition, one cannot look at the world through a single lens, cannot respond to a single set of inputs or demands. The whole essence of positions of broad responsibility or authority is to try to integrate, balance, prioritize, usually a myriad of competing interests. And I think we've seen some real failures to do that during this last year. We all know where the road of good intentions leads, and it has led us there in too many cases, I think, this last year. We can go into the specifics of that in the questions if you like. I think secondly, looking ahead to the great careers that await all of you, something else that's been in demand for a long time, been in short supply in our democracy, I think for quite some time, in some contrast to a few others I could name, and that is a grasp of technology and science, those things which are producing so much of the change, often the conflict and tension in our society, sometimes the inequalities in our society, and the leadership cadre that is passing off the scene now didn't know very much about those things, or hadn't schooled itself adequately, in my opinion. And that just won't do going forward. We've seen some really bad judgments made, some truly amateurish, I think, misreadings of data and statistics and what science was really telling us as we tried to manage our way through this pandemic. And the need for science, some scientific acumen or basic grasp at least, which probably most of you have collected along your educational paths, will really be at a premium, I think, if we're going to make smart, wise, and just public decisions in the future. And I guess the last thing I'll say by way of introduction is that I don't know what the future holds. I hope there'll be some swinging of the pendulum, which right now has gone pretty far in the direction of personal vilification, even the criminalization of genuine policy differences. And I hope there'll be, or that we'll find leaders who will fashion a new vocabulary of reconciliation, of unity, that will help their fellow citizens recognize the folly and the fundamental injustice, really, of some of the things that have crept into the culture. That'll be a tough assignment, but Rumsfeld Fellows are exactly the kind of people that I know that America has always found in its difficult moments, and we're very fortunate that with Secretary Rumsfeld's help, it's found each of you. So congratulations on your selection, and I'll be happy to try to deal with some of the questions that have been posed.
Well, as usual, you got to the heart of the matter right away, and you might have answered my last question, but my first question, which was really my last question, I was afraid we would never get around to it, was all stories and lives have a beginning, a middle, and the end. But they don't have to be told in that order. So in case we don't get to the critical last question, let's start with, and maybe you've answered this, this Rumsfeld Foundation Graduate Fellowship Conference is centered around the themes of future challenges and the necessary toolbox for future leaders. What do you think are the top future challenges that this country faces? And what are the tools that the future leaders will need to face them?
I'll start with the fact that we are going bankrupt as a country. History is littered with the bones of once proud societies who spent themselves and borrowed themselves into impossible corners. We were already in some danger of that before the almost unimaginable splurge of the last few months. One can say, I think that there was no choice. That was necessary to do this to revive an economy which we had consciously decided to shut down. Was not the only choice available. And but that then simply raises the question of why were we so deeply in the red to start with? And we'd have been a lot better off if we'd started at a position closer to solvency. So there's one that it's a classical problem of democracy. Or of leadership, I guess, in other realms. There's always a reward for addressing the immediate and that is the short term, the immediate, and the specific problem, at the expense of the long term cost, which is diffused, broadly across a society or an electorate. And it will, the next generation of leaders who should already know this, but as you and your counterparts arrive at positions of high authority, are going to rightly feel very aggrieved that your predecessors handed you enormous unpayable bills that have now moved past the point where we can actually deal with them without default by one name or another. So there's one. Enormous ethical and societal problems coming because of the scientific genius that our age has given birth to. We already can see it. People concerned about growing inequality of wealth in the country have tended to look in all the wrong places. It's not about taxation and so forth. We already have the most progressive tax system in the entire OECD. You can only push that so much further. It's much more about a winner-take-all type economy in which a handful of very, very bright people have amassed unbelievable market positions and incredible wealth. We're going to see, I think, only unless we find some structural changes, an exacerbation of that. Just listened to a very interesting talk by one of the, I think, fine observers of our culture. He lives in California, and he's talking about the feudal society that he sees growing out there. A handful of oligarchs at the top, a lot of people doing very menial work to support them at the bottom, not much in the middle. That's a very bad formula. The democracy is, I think it's fair to say, generally required a strong middle class. And it'll be a really important thing to find ways to maintain that or regrow that, regenerate it in some cases when technology is continuing, I think, to push us in another direction. So there are two big ones, I think, Randy, and maybe I'll add some to that, to me, rather daunting list when we get to other questions.
I think that's just a follow-up. I think it's a great beginning, but what tools are going to be needed to fix the problem?
Yeah.
Your diagnosis sounds spot on, but what's the cure?
Well, I mentioned two things already. One is, I think, some degree of fluency. We don't need a lot of Nobel Prize winners. I've always wished that our Congress looked a little more like, for instance, the Israeli Knesset, which has a lot of scientists and mathematicians in it. It's not quite so dominated by lawyers and the like. But a degree of fluency that allows people to make decisions, again, balancing interests and not be overwhelmed or cowed by people who are flashing their technological or scientific credentials at them. So I think that's one important tool. I have to say, well, another one that I briefly mentioned was people who can succeed. And right now the deck seems incredibly stacked through the polarity that we're looking at. But in trying to gather people together again, my one tour in elected office, I was constantly preaching to our team that we're going to practice the politics of addition and never division. And why? Not just to win elections. That's a means, not an end. I always used to try to remind people that we're here to do big things, and big change requires big majorities. You don't effect large and lasting change with 50.1. And so to do that, you have to find a way to try to gather people together around an interest they can identify as common, and try to convey to them that your heart is with improvement in their lives. We don't have many people doing that right now, and we're going to have to work our way back from a situation in which way too many Americans have decided that it's us and them, and us is right and them is wrong, and us is virtuous and them is evil. And that's going to take some real skill. I hope that there'll be an exhaustion finally, and I hope a revulsion against the politics of division, which both left and right are practicing. I can argue that the left is far more vicious about this than people I see on the right who are bad enough. And so that'll take some skill, that's real skill from a new generation of people. And I'll just throw one more tool in the box that's been there before, but it's probably more important than ever, and that's scar tissue, or at least a thick, as we say, a thick skin. I learned a long time ago, and Don Rumsfeld can surely tell you this too, that if you want to get big things done, you're going to have to accept as a cost of doing business that people will say untrue, unfair, often really cruel things about you, and you can't do much about it. You just have to take it and resolve that it's the results that matter long term. And so if that's been true over the last era, it's more true than it's ever been right now. And so I empathize with those who will occupy significant positions and try to do big things or even small things for the unfair attacks that will now occur and are amplified by the new, as I usually say, anti-social media that dominates our debates. So I hope I'm not dissuading any of you from jumping in and into the to TR's arena, but you need to jump in with all that in full view.
No, I think that's great. And far from dissuading anybody from jumping into the arena, I think we have a lot of fellows who aspire and are already in the arena and want to stay in the arena. And I think they'd be interested to hear what inspired you, or who inspired you to enter the arena and to begin with, and what keeps drawing you back to the arena.
Well, I don't know if I've been drawn back or pulled back. Sometimes I feel like those who, Randy will remember, if the fellows don't, that Michael Corleone said every time he thought he was out, they pulled him back in, that was a different kind of endeavor, but I know the feeling. No, I mean, I think that the ultimate satisfaction in life is a sense that one has made something better for significant numbers of people. There's so many opportunities to do that in all realms, but the public service certainly offers that potential, and that's why it's worth paying a price in personal aggravation and sometimes frustration. But that's certainly what I always found attractive about it. I was inspired. I was lucky enough early on. I had a curiosity as a very young person. I was very lucky to come into the orbit of some tremendous leaders, and that luck followed me along the way. I will say I'm not sure I've ever, can't think of an exception, ever found one of these how-to books that did much for me. There's one there, every airport bookshelf is filled with them. I'm not sure any of them's worth anything. The two ways that I hope I learned some lessons that I could apply were either working with people who brought high integrity, high purpose, big game hunter's instinct for doing significant things, not just being a caretaker, to their jobs. And I've always encouraged younger people who want to know about leadership to read biographies. And by the way, our moderator here is one of the great biographers of our day, but along with his books, there are many about the great figures who have preceded us. And to me, those are the best textbooks of all.
Were Richard Lugar and Ronald Reagan two of the textbooks?
Yes, they were two of those I was able to observe firsthand. There were one or two in my business years, which was the longest continuous stretch I did anything, and then many others that I came in contact with. I could go on and on. One of the best, sometimes the best lessons are the simplest. I'm just suddenly reminiscing about a very dark day for me when I had made a mistake that I thought brought discredit or difficulty to the White House I was serving in. And the then Secretary of Commerce, Malcolm Baldrige, for whom the Baldrige Quality Award is named, knew I was down in the dumps and put his arm on my shoulder and said, he said, "Hey, look, just remember, Mitch, that good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment." And since I've made more than my share of bad judgments, I've accumulated some experience and taken consolation in his advice.
That's interesting. You are, I think, unique as far as, and I don't want to throw that word around, but you've enjoyed success in the business world, in the political world, in the academic world. Do you see a benefit in negotiating these different worlds, of moving back and forth between business and politics, and then leaping into academia? I come from an era, from a position where we're academics from the beginning, and that's all we do.
I don't want to. I think it'd be easy to make a lot of facile observations about how skills are totally portable and the challenges are parallel, and there's something to that. But these are different worlds. I just feel very fortunate. I got to spend a significant time in all three sectors of society, including the nonprofit in two different ways. And I do think that if you stay alert to our lessons, they're definitely lessons that apply, and one can take from one post to the next, even if it's a very qualitatively different job. But also to be respectful of the differences. Never fail to remind yourself of what you don't know in a new environment or a new organization. Keep your head about you there. And I've seen a lot of people believe, to their eventual detriment, that they can take a formula that worked well in a previous position or a previous life or a previous company, and then transplant it and force it on an operation which may have very fundamentally different characteristics. So yeah, there are things that clearly I think it adds to one's experience and broadens you, but I think you have to be careful not to loosely apply lessons from one life to the next.
Okay. Let's talk maybe a little bit about leadership. Many of the fellows tuned in today would undoubtedly be interested to follow in some of your footsteps as aspiring governors or university presidents, presidential appointees, think tank CEOs. Of the different positions you've held, where do you feel like you learned the most about leadership, and why?
In business. I've had this question asked many, many times, and so I have thought about it some, and particularly, for instance, in the last job, I was asked all the time, what had I done before that applied to being a governor, and people always expected I was going to answer with something out of public life, and of course those experiences came in handy now and then. But by far, I would always answer by far where I learned most was in business. You can't hide from accountability. There's a market share number to meet. There's a stock price to meet. There's a net margin number to meet. There's the problem with government and the nonprofit world is that you have to implant accountability too often. You don't have the pressure of competition, especially in government, which is the last monopoly we permit. And so learning to make ends meet, that is to say, to be really aggressive about trying to make certain that it's not your, remember, it's not your money that you're spending. It's either the shareholders' money or the taxpayers' money or the donors' money. And so being absolutely committed to spending each dollar to maximum effect is something that business helps train you for. Getting large numbers of people, talented people, ambitious people, pointed in a common direction and working together effectively, each pulling their particular oar. That's the essence, I think, of trying to get something done successfully. I see government fail miserably at this all the time. You know, most government gangs can't shoot straight, in the old cliche. And you know, again, I think years in the business, I always encourage young people that I meet who say, "Oh gosh, I really want to serve the public. I'm very excited about government politics." I say, "Well, great, but I really strongly encourage you to build some skills, spend some time in the important sector of society, that is the private world, the one that pays the bills, and not only build some credentials, but also some appreciation for what government's actions can mean, and often the negative effects that they can have." So I've always said, Randy, that of all the great opportunities that came along, the one I would trade away last is the 11 or 12 years that I spent at Eli Lilly and Company.
That's interesting. What about, you know, I was thinking about it, serving as a governor of a state with a real accountability. You have to get roads cleaned up. You have to live kind of within your means. I think about early in the 20th century, how many of our presidents had been governors? Theodore Roosevelt was a governor, I believe. FDR was a governor. Yeah. Wilson was a governor, where we had, and they were all successful presidents. They were all able to get an agenda through Congress. Do you think there's something inherent about the role of governor that translates well into national politics that we don't have much today?
Well, yes, I do. And obviously it translates. You know, Obama was the first president since JFK to come from the Senate. And before Kennedy, I don't know how far back we have to go. No, a governor, more than any other background, has been the preparatory step or the launching pad for presidents, and why? And it makes good sense. It's an executive job like president. It's a doer's job, not a talker's job. Not that ability to communicate isn't central to it. Of course it is, but people who have wrestled successfully with the problems of a state or a significant state, you know, have had to make a lot of those balancing decisions that I talked about. It's not just about issuing a press release, and you know, people in Washington sometimes think success is that their talking points got them 8 seconds on the national news. No, I mean, governors, as you say, now some have found ways around this, but you know, unlike people in the national level, don't have the opportunity to borrow unlimited amounts. I remember when I came to office, and one of the motivators for coming was our state was broke, and therefore unable to do things to build a better future for people. And I remember saying to the public and others, I said, the first thing I did when I got in this office was look in all the closets to see if there was a printing press, and there's not. You know, we're not the federal government. We can't just print money, monopoly money. We're going to have to find ways to live within our means and build an economy which generates revenue so we can do active, aggressive things make this state better. So those are the kind of questions that governors wrestle with. You know, I attended governors' meetings. I wasn't a very good joiner, but I did go to the big one they had every year in Washington. When you get a bunch of governors in a room in Washington, they are, I don't want to say disdainful, but they're tend to be a little sarcastic. They feel like they can't avoid dealing with real issues and making hard decisions, and they sometimes look at their legislative and federal counterparts as getting to skate on those. So I said a minute ago that I think people who hope one day to occupy positions of significant authority really ought to try to spend some time extensive time in the private sector. But I would also say that local government, because everything I just said about governors is true of mayors too. In fact, their job is even more immediate. My first jobs were in local government. Lugar, who you mentioned, was the mayor of Indianapolis before he became now a world-renowned senator. And you know, that was pretty satisfying work, even at the age of 21. That I always said, at the end of the day, if I just got a dead dog dragged off somebody's yard, I had done something that made a difference for somebody. And again, it had an immediacy and a concrete character that some positions in public life don't.
Then you transition to academia, which is a whole different ball game. Were there lessons that you could bring in from your previous jobs, your previous experience that applied to academia? Was there anything about academia that surprised you?
Yeah, well, what surprised me most was the food. That's what I told all my friends who asked that question back at the time. You know, college food is supposed to be terrible and standard, and but when I got here, I discovered that all changed in the interval since I'd been around it. More seriously, of course, there were lessons that applied, and I'll have to say that higher education has led a very privileged existence in this country for a long time. And even a university had been relatively well run like this one had all kinds of I'll say, a slack to be taken out. And people have asked now for 8 years going on 9, how is it that Purdue has been able to operate without a tuition increase and actually with reductions in room and board? And the answer is it's really not all that hard if you make that your priority and if you go looking for it. On the other hand, there's so much that was different, and I've tried to be enormously respectful of those differences, of all the things I didn't know. I still feel like a rookie in many ways, but if you're lucky enough, and you fellows will be, to have life present unexpected opportunities to you, which your talents and achievements as you add to them will merit. If you're lucky enough to have those kind of things, I encourage you to be open to them, even jump into them, but do so, as I said a little while ago, knowing that only to suspect your own certitude about lessons you've learned before. They may or may not fit the new situation.
Speaking of challenges, what about COVID-19? Has it changed how you see the future of higher education or the impact of COVID-19 on not just now, not just today, not just this year, but going down a few years?
Absolutely, and that'll be true of more institutions and businesses and industries than not, I suspect. It's been said for a long time, I think quite correctly, that cataclysmic events, crises, and so forth don't so much create new trends as they accelerate trends that were already in motion and may be apparent. You can see that in higher ed. You can see that in so many other areas. Think about healthcare. You know, telemedicine was sort of inching along, and now it's going to be a big piece of the future. And likewise in higher ed, I mean, there's two things that are, I think, readily apparent. One is that online and new, as they say, modalities, that's the way you guys put it, Randy, modalities of teaching, uh, whether they are purely virtual or, as we see more often right now, hybrid, a blend of in-person and technologically delivered education. Clearly, this is going to be it was coming anyway, it's going to be a much bigger part of the future starting right now. And those who master it well, I think will do well. And those who resist it or deny its reality will pay a price. And then, speaking of paying a price, the other thing is that the business model of higher education was fraying, was crumbling, I guess I'll say, anyway. And this will really, I'm afraid, accelerate that. We've already seen an increase in the number of schools going out of business altogether. I don't know that I buy some of the more apocalyptic predictions that a quarter to a third will disappear in the next 10 years, but they might. And you know, those that had allowed themselves to live beyond their means, to do so on the basis of extraordinarily high tuitions and fees, will now really struggle, I think, unless they're in that lucky group that's sitting on massive and bulletproof endowments, but there's only a handful of those. So yeah, higher ed's going to look very different more quickly, I think, than it would have had this not happened.
From the fellows, there was some interest in the Purdue Moves initiative. What brought about that initiative, and what is Purdue Moves?
It's nothing more than a series of, I'll call them strategic objectives that we formulated during my first months here. I'll tell the story because I think it has something to do, I think it's some general applicability. As I made a study about this world I was getting ready to enter, I had about 6 months between saying yes, finishing the old job and getting ready. And I tried to use that, as I always say, to get from kindergarten to third grade or something about higher ed. Well, new presidents generally come in, they have this giant strategic planning exercise, and every cook gets in the kitchen and everybody throws in their ideas, and they take a long time, a year, then they produce some great big thick book. And if you look at those, they tend to say nothing because they say everything. The smartest thing I ever said about strategy is it's defined by what it leaves out, not what it incorporates. And if you can't name important things that aren't there, then it's not a strategy, it's a wish list. It's everybody's, you know, they've tried to accommodate everybody, and nothing real will happen because it has to be about making choices. So Purdue Moves, I had a few ideas when we got here. We tried we shopped around, we found a few more things that people on campus said this would make us a stronger, more attractive university. By about August, we listed 10 of them and went to work on them. They included things as big as a big expansion of our STEM capability. We were already a STEM-centric school. I always thought, number one, that we talked about how technology is driving the world and change these days, that this was something that our state and nation needed more of. There was national reports that we need 10,000 more engineers, but the most important thing per year is the most important thing America could do. Okay. I said Purdue will handle the first 8%. And so we did that. We built the STEM capability. Another principle that always made common sense to me was do more what you're good at. We were good at this, so let's become great at it. This went on down to much smaller caliber things like tripling the number of students studying abroad, for instance, which in an area in which we lagged. So that's what it was, Randy. And I guess I would sum this up by saying to the fellows that always, I think, when you're contemplating a new position or starting something, the first question is the why question. And you know, why why would I do that? Why would I accept that job or seek that job? And I should not be in the answer. So I'm not critical necessarily that people say, well, I have a passion for this or that, or I've always wanted to serve, and, you know, well and good, but what are you going to, why would you take that job? How would that business, that state, that enterprise be different and better, or the people it comprises, how would they be better off? You know, what are you going to do about it? And that's why that's kind of what Purdue Moves was about. Let's get busy here. Let's don't spend 2 years talking about it. Let's identify a few things that will make this place stronger and better and go do them.
That sounds great. 2011, you published a book called Keeping the Republic, Saving America by Trusting Americans, which looked at America's past and looked at where America was going. Could you revisit the premise of the book, and has it come true? Has things progressed the way you saw them progressing, or do we still need the same prescriptions?
Well, it certainly has not come true. I mean, the book was, I think, realistic about saying that it can't prove this, that democracy has always been a risk, someone has written, and has always involved a leap of faith. And I think the book was pretty candid about acknowledging that. I'm not sure I'd write the same book today, and I hate saying that. The premise of the book was that we could speak to each other as adults in this country, that we had choices to make, that we had choices about how much of our children's or future generations' money we should spend on ourselves, which is what we've been doing in running up a massive national debt. It had as its premise, I said, what kind of people will we be? There's a line in there, people have played back to me, I caught their ear. I said, will we be creatures of dignity or objects of therapy? The premise of the book was that people can make their own decisions, people at all stations of life. And I gave illustrations, for instance, a healthcare plan for the near poor that we created in Indiana, which was built on individual autonomy, a health savings account for poor people, as I described it. And we saw low-income people make very smart decisions about their own health care, using more generic drugs, being more careful about the emergency, going to the emergency room, asking for second opinions. When parents are given more choices about their children's education, they make wise ones and thoughtful ones. And so the premise of the book was that we should trust Americans to make their own decisions, and we should empower them to do so every way we can, and that we should respect their dignity, and that when we decide that they're just not up to it, they can't cut it, I talk about, there's a chapter I think called our benevolent betters, people who in their hearts believe, that these poor benighted folks just can't lead their own lives effectively. They really need me, to show them what to do or prevent them from making the wrong choices. So that was the book. And, in what at the time I had to explain to people, it's interesting, you don't anymore. At the time people said, what's that mean, keeping the Republic? I say, well, Ben Franklin at Constitution Hall, maybe apocryphally, but supposedly, a woman asked him, what kind of government have you given us? And he said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. The founders were very conscious that this fragile little experiment, getting away from monarchs and dictators and autocrats to government of, by, and for the people, might not last. And so I can't say that book would match the reality, which I hope is temporary. But I still believe it describes the challenge that we have if we want to remain a genuinely self-governing people.
Well, President Daniels, you have answered the questions. We appreciate you dropping in on this virtual conference, and it's a great kickoff. And I think George Will is still right.
Well, I think Don Rumsfeld is right to have created a program like this and set it up. So, as I understand that you couldn't nominate yourself for this. Nobody else could. You had to. Somebody else had to identify you. So, as I think I said before, we've had tough times in this country before. Some people's sense of history doesn't any longer help them understand that, but you fellows probably do. And at some of the darkest moments, even darker than this one, somehow America has called into the service men and women who found a way to lead us out of it. And I'm going to assume that some of you are in that group.
Thank you.